When did the ancient world end? When did the medieval world begin? By what socio-political, economic changes do we define those two eras? How can we be sure that our definitions don't have more to do with our own biases as opposed to the actual on-the-ground reality for those people at the time? At least since the great British historian Edward Gibbon, a traditional date for that change from ancient to medieval has been 476 AD, when the last Western Roman Emperor, Romulus Augustus, was displaced by the barbarian king Odoacer. Okay, so that's the Wikipedia version, but there's some serious problems with that model. Okay, so Gibbon was great, and his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, absolutely, indisputably, the work in Roman history. You know, as Tolkien was to fantasy literature, Edward Gibbon was to Roman history. But Gibbon wrote in the late 18th century, you know, he was a contemporary of the American founding fathers. Like, our picture of the end, if indeed it be an end, of the Roman Empire in the West has been greatly refined or greatly complicated as well, depending on your perspective, since then. So in 476, Odoacer rules in Rome. Think about people on the outskirts in Germania and Britannia, you know, all these outer provinces. How does their life really change if a Roman or a so-called barbarian rules in Rome? Like, all the rulers in all these other provinces, they're locals already. British people are ruling in Britannia, but they act, dress, and kind of behave like Romans. You know, identity is a very weird, slippery thing. Like, what makes you where you're from? Or what determines your national identity? Where you were born? Or how you behave? In the 1920s and 1930s, the Belgian historian Henri Pirenne wrote Muhammad et Charlemagne, or Muhammad and Charlemagne, and he pretty much pointed this out for the first time. You know, Pirenne said, hey, wait a second, there's actually a lot of continuity in how people lived, from the very end of the Roman Empire up through the 5th, 6th, even the 7th centuries. You know, even the word barbarian, like barbarian king, that's got this weird, like, xenophobic tone to it, right? Like it's this weird us against them thing. Now here's where your boy Pirenne got a little bit controversial. He argued that the Middle Ages didn't begin in 476, but actually not until the Muslim conquest disrupted the unity of Mediterranean society in, like, the 700s. Now Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire of the 7 and 800s was purely an inland power. You know, they don't have access to a sea in any geographic direction. This was a massive change for Europe. You know, for the first time in history, to quote Pirenne, the axis of Occidental civilization was displaced towards the north. One more quote. It is therefore strictly correct to say that without Muhammad, Charlemagne would have been inconceivable. Basically meaning that without the Muslim conquests, you know, the Carolingians would not have created this powerful inland empire, and the axis of Western Europe would not have shifted north as it did. Now, this argument stimulated a ton of research, so much in fact that it's been critiqued so much that not a ton of people agree with it now. But it did have the effect of completely displacing the idea of a radical break in 476, as Gibbon would have argued. Pirenne's defending of this thesis during his time has a lot to do with him being a product of his times. You know, he was a proponent of the Annales school of history, which emphasizes long-term socioeconomic trends much more so over the accomplishments of the individual. Now, the de-emphasizing of the individual picked up some steam in the post-World War II climate, when European intellectuals were, maybe understandably, kind of disaffected with the idea of powerful individuals shaping the course of history. Now, bear in mind, I'm not saying that any of them were wrong because they were influenced by the tenor of their times. You know, all history writing is influenced by the tenor of its times. It's unavoidable. Even things written today. So for our question, when does the ancient world end and when does the Middle Ages begin, you can safely associate the date 476 with Edward Gibbon in the 18th century. You can safely associate the approximate date of the Muslim conquests with Henri Pirenne in the early 20th century. In the late 90s, we got another theory. The American historian Bernard Bachrach, who still works at the University of Minnesota, by the way, he argued that, wait a second, hang on, Charlemagne basically acted like a Western Roman emperor. Charlemagne's own biographer Einhard sought to portray him as the 13th Caesar, in deference to Suetonius and the lives of the 12 Caesars. Charlemagne built great buildings like all the old Caesars did. This was completely essential to the Roman imperial persona. It was Augustus himself who said that he found Rome made of clay and he left it made of marble. He ruled the church like all the later Western Roman emperors did. He conquered territory like the old Western Roman emperors. So much, in fact, that the Eastern Roman Empire, which lasted, by the way, all the way up until the 15th century, they may have viewed him as the Western Roman emperor. So at least as far as his behavior was concerned, even though the empire had fallen 3 centuries before, Charlemagne was essentially a Western Roman emperor. So when did the ancient world end and when did the medieval period begin? Well, that's 3 theories you've got. You've got 476, that's Edward Gibbon. You've got the date of the Muslim conquest, that's Henri Pirenne. And you've got Charlemagne, sometime after Charlemagne, I guess. That's Bernard Bachrach. I hope you weren't expecting an easy answer. 2 final points. Number 1, it might be tempting to think this is just like overly pedantic and too focused on semantics. And to a small extent, I do see that argument. But on the other hand, defining periods does matter. Like, it matters for all sorts of other studies, all sorts of other aspects of how we look at the past. Like, if you say that this doesn't matter, then you have to say that it doesn't matter how we define Generation X, Generation Y, baby boomers, millennials, whatever. Categories do matter, and getting them as accurate as possible does matter. Secondly, I do want to stress that even though we do categorize and, break the past into different eras, one thing you should take away from this is that there is always, always, always more continuity than difference from one era to the next. Like when you hear the words, when did the ancient world end and the medieval world begin, just understand that that's our category. And life didn't change all that much for people back then. Like, nobody in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, or 9th century was like, all right, well, now we live in the Middle Ages. All right, anyways, that's it for now. If you're new here, thanks for watching. Consider subscribing. If you're old here, thanks for watching, and please don't unsubscribe. Like, dislike, comment, subscribe. You people know what to do. You've been on YouTube before. Anyways, that's it for now. World-renowned historian, I'm gonna get out of here, kiddos. Peace out.